I've got that traced all the way around. The original bait builders, a lot of that was done by hand with whether it's a pocket knife or a razor knife. That as well is going to affect how much action the bait has. Right there is going to be about what our finished bait's going to look like. Boy, that's pretty close there now. That's a pretty running little dude. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Glad you're back here today to check out this video. This is something that I've wanted to do here in the garage for quite some time, and a video that it's going to be a few parts. Number one to this. This is part number one. Something that I love to do, I've done for a really long time, and has gained some more press here lately, is actually making crankbaits. That's something that I started making them when I was in high school. I think was some of the very first crankbaits that I ever made was like when I was a freshman in high school, and a lot of the love for that came from the guy that I grew up fishing a lot with, Jason Nichols. His dad actually made homemade crankbaits, and living in East Tennessee, there were a lot of guys around here who made a lot of different homemade crankbaits. But Jason and I fishing together, his dad making those baits, of course he had boxes full of them, and it was really neat to show up fishing against fishing in a tournament, against 100, 150, 200 other boats, and knowing we had a bait that nobody else in the tournament had because his dad had made them, just for him and I to fish with. So that was something that it always gave us a lot of confidence, just knowing that we had a different bait from anybody else that we were going to fish around all day. And that's truly where a lot of the love for my crankbait building came from, was from Steve Nichols, and he taught me a lot about it. Now, he did it the much more old-fashioned way. He would use a saw to cut out the overall profile of the bait, but everything else he did from there basically was by hand. He would drill the holes with a drill, but his whittling, he actually would whittle those baits by hand. Everything I do basically has got a tool involved with it, whether that's from the scroll saw, another jigsaw here, or a router, and the drill press. I'm trying to do it as controlled as I possibly can. When you're whittling those baits by hand, you're always going to whittle them a little bit different. You do still have to sand some obviously by hand, but using as many tools as I can, power tools like this, it allows me to make those baits as uniform as I possibly could. So, and then another thing I want to start with saying, you'll see this is a process, and when you get started in this, you're going to make way more baits that never run to get started with than you do that will run or will catch fish. It took me, oh my goodness, I want to say one of the very first ones I made, actually it wiggled, you could say, but out of like the next 100 I made, I bet you 10 of them were all that actually ran at all. I mean, and not running true. I'm just saying that they actually would dive and would wiggle underwater. Most of those wouldn't run true. Out of probably 100, it was less than 5 that actually were worth even keeping. That's how bad it typically is as a learning curve to start with. So that, just want to say all that before I really get started into this whole process. But for me, when I'm making baits, everything I always liked to make was a flat-sided crankbait. So I would actually buy just sheets of balsa that were the thickness of what I wanted to start with. A lot of the baits that I made were 3/8 inch. Made some out of 1/2 inch, but 3/8 was kind of my go-to. I like that little bit thinner material. And then the big thing when you're very first drawing a bait out, you always want to make sure that you lay it along the grains. If you lay it this way, that bait's going to be extremely weak, and you can break it in half, because you can break this piece of wood that way with the grains, but you can't hardly break it across the grains. It's extremely tough that way. So you want to make sure, number one, that when you go to trace your baits out, that they are, along the grains, nose to tail, line up with the grains of that wood. So once you've determined you want 3/8 or half, just whatever thickness that you want that bait to end up being, step one is just drawing it out onto that block of wood. So for me, I've got a pattern here that I'm going to work off of. If you are just freehanding, you want to draw something out, try some different shapes to start with. That's a good way to do that. Sketch them on a piece of paper or on the block of balsa. But I've got my pattern, I've got it laid on here, and I'm just going to trace around that. I'm going to make 4 or 5 baits or so on here that I'm going to trace. So I've got that traced all the way around. And just kind of flip it over and nest it back under that one. Give yourself a little bit of space there to work with. And again, those are all laid head to tail, you know, in line with the grains to add strength to that bait. Here's the fourth one. I could for sure get 5. I maybe could get 6 on there if I wanted to. We've got us 4 baits drawn out on there, and we're going to go ahead and we're just going to cut this off all the way down through there, and then we'll end up cutting out each bait individually. So at this time, this is where the earplugs and the safety goggles come on. I mean, these are some real nice top level safety goggles right here now. So we're gonna put these on, put some goggles on. We will be making a crankbait as safely as it's ever been done. All right, and I'll probably start yelling because I can't hear myself. But yeah, we're gonna cut this off, and then we'll individually cut each bait out after that. One thing I forgot to mention right here. When that bait is traced on there, okay, a little bit of carpentry talk, the line is all the way around the outside of it, right? So to be able to get the bait that I'm about to cut out of there to be the exact same size, I've got to cut off all of the line. You don't want to leave the line. You don't want to cut way inside of it, but you want to be right on the inside edge of that line. This is a really thin blade on this saw, so I can watch it really close. If I leave a little bit of line, no big deal. I've got a sanding block here. I can go back after that and you know, sand that area down a little bit. But you want to keep that in mind. You don't want to leave the line all the way around, or your bait that you're cutting out is going to be considerably bigger than what you actually started with as your pattern. So I could start at the nose, work my way around and cut it out. I'll start at the nose on this one, so on and so forth. All right, so we've got us a couple of those cut out, and we'll see. They're pretty similar to each other. And they're pretty similar to what we started with. Every bait, I mean, if you're cutting them out individually like that, every bait's going to be a little bit different. That's just the way it is. You know, that's part of making handmade crankbaits, is that they're all going to be a little bit unique. It's hard to get them all identical. So as long as they're pretty close, I'm happy with that. That one's got a little bit of a knot on his head, some rough edges around it. I'm going to go ahead and take this sanding block. I'm going to work my way around them, just kind of smooth out some of those places that I'm not crazy about, and then we'll be ready for the next step. And this is where, like I mentioned, a lot of those guys, the original bait builders, they would, you know, even this part, a lot of that was done by hand with whether it's a pocket knife or a razor knife or whatever. Man, they did it a lot harder way to try to make baits uniform. You know, they just didn't have the tools and stuff, which was why those old baits were, one, there weren't a lot of them. They were very expensive. And if a guy got one hung up, he was pretty well willing to jump in the water and go get it off the bottom of the lake, whatever it took to get those baits back. Because the ones that were good were really, really good. The overall shape of those, it's nice and smooth, no hard edges on it anywhere, you know, on the nose or on the tail. Everything is pretty smooth. And so our next step, we're gonna move right over here and go to the router. And that's one thing that with that bit, so that is a 3/16 inch bit, which is half of that 3/8 bait. If I was doing a 1/2 inch bait, I would need a 1/4 inch bit. You always want your router bit to be half of whatever the thickness of your bait is. And that's just a rounding over bit. That's going to help make those edges of that bait. It's going to knock those edges off, help round them over. It'll require more sanding. Every step requires a little bit of sanding when you're working with this balsa wood. But that's going to be the next step. So let's move over here to the router next. And this is a very tedious part of this process because that thing is going to be spinning really fast and I'm going to be really, really close to it. This is where the guys who whittled were really a lot safer. You wouldn't think telling somebody that using a razor knife was a safer way to do something, but it probably really would be in this situation because that thing is spinning really fast and I'll be right up against it. But once we're done with this step, we'll have a nice rounded edge bait on both sides. A really good quality router bit is extremely important. I actually filled in some of these grooves on here to make it a smooth surface. I've got a little bit of plastic around there because the hole was so big. A lot of little customizations going on right here on this router table to help and make it better for using, you know, I'm not working with a piece of wood this big working around on there. What I'm working with is little bitty stuff right up there really close to it. So here we go. All right, so now we've got two baits that have rounded off a little bit, and you'll always see when you start either climbing or descending on those grains of the wood, it always gives you a little bit of rough edges in a couple places, and it's always the same place on every single bait, just due to the way the grains of the wood are going and the way that you're pushing it against that router bit. So we'll take our sanding block here, and we will we'll knock those edges off, and then we'll have our finished body. Okay, that's that'll be the body of the crankbait. That's everything with that's done. The next video, the next part, we're going to go from there and really start breaking down so much else that goes on from this point. You get to this, you're like, oh man, I've got a crankbait, I'm almost done. You're just barely getting started. Okay, so we're going to sand this guy just a little bit, and then we'll pick back up in part 2. So thanks for watching this. We're going to knock some edges off. We'll be ready to go with this blank.